As part of this critical conversation, last week we dropped the bill, Senate Bill 254, which would eliminate felony convictions for possession of marijuana. This bill does not decriminalize or legalize marijuana, but what it does do is eliminate possession as a felony. And also, more importantly, what it does do is give the citizens of Georgia the opportunity to actually embark on their lives in a meaningful way. For instance, this bill would ensure that persons would not lose scholarship money, such as the Hope Scholarship or federal aid scholarships. For instance, this bill would make sure that persons would not be precluded from sitting on juries, or persons would not be precluded from having the right to vote. This bill would ensure that a young lady would not have the opportunity to lose her benefits from the federal government, whether those are under TANF or whether those are under SNAP. What this bill does is bring people out of economic and social prison. The question always is, how many persons are incarcerated for just possession of marijuana? And I would make the point that the incarceration goes further than just being in the penitentiary. The incarceration goes to a young college student who loses his benefits. The incarceration goes to social incarceration to the young lady who loses her benefits from the federal government because of a felony conviction of marijuana. So that is what this bill does do. It opens up opportunities for people who can lose their licenses if they have to have a license in their particular profession, such as being a lawyer. It gives them opportunity and hope. So as Georgia leads the way on so many issues, and we have led the way in business, we have led the way with the Hope Scholarship, we have led the way now as we've attracted different industries, the Hollywood of the South, so to speak. Now it is also time for us to lead the way on this necessary criminal justice issue. As Georgia leads, the nation always follows. And as we have this particular conversation, please make note that we're not alone in doing that. Some 20 states treat small amounts of marijuana as just infractions. It is only an infraction in some states. They may still penalize for misdemeanor or felony, but if for low amounts of marijuana, it is simply an infraction. No criminal record at all. Some states only charge persons with misdemeanor possession of marijuana and do not have felonies at all. And then those states that actually do punish for felonies, Georgia is in the minority as far as the amount is concerned. Many states take their amounts from 6 ounces to 8 ounces to maybe even a pound, depending on the state. So we have much room to work, and we have a lot of work to do. So I would encourage this to be a bipartisan effort as we continue this criminal justice reform. And it's not just criminal justice reform, it's human rights reform. As Georgia always leads, I think we can be a leader in this particular area, and we have to do it. And we can start working with our citizens in getting that done. And what I'd like to do now is turn it over. First, I'd have our Madam Chairperson, Ms. Dawkins, come speak. And she is the chairperson of the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus, and she will also address. Then we're going to have various members from activist groups also will address you. And then from there, we'll have time for a few questions if we can take those up.
Thank you so much, Senator Jones. And so I am so proud of the work that Senator Jones is taking in this initiative to try to get some parity as it relates to marijuana sentencing in the state of Georgia. Again, I am Dee Dawkins Hagler. I am the chair of the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus. And so I will be introducing on the House side companion legislation to make sure that we can get this done in this state. As you know, in the state of Georgia, there are 10 million people in the state of Georgia, but 3 million African Americans. And African Americans have received disproportionate sentencing as it relates to marijuana possession. And so the bill on the House side is going to go a step further so that when you are arrested for less than an ounce of marijuana, that it will only be a ticket, a citation, as he mentioned previously. Because so many people, when they are arrested for simple possession of marijuana, it takes away from their livelihood, the ability to be able to go to college and get scholarships, the ability to be able to get jobs, or if they are working, they may lose their employment because they had a simple possession charge. And so this is something that we have to work on. We have to be honest and have a genuine conversation in the state of Georgia of how we deal with disproportionate sentencing. And so we in the Black Caucus stand behind Senator Jones, and we're going to do all that we can to work towards making sure that no one will get felony charges as it relates to marijuana unless they're serious traffickers, but to make sure that people have due process. So thank you.
And Senator Ford, did you also want to?
I'll be real quick. First of all, Come on now. You act like we don't know you.
Oh my. First of all, thank all the members of the media for being here. But I want to especially thank Senator Jones for his cutting edge thinking in putting this bill forward. The only thing that I want to say is that out in my district, in the grocery stores, in churches, and other places that I frequent, I often get have conversations with constituents whose lives have been changed by a possession conviction. They don't have access to education. They don't have access to jobs. Too often, a possession of a small amount of marijuana is a barrier that follows citizens, that follows Georgians for the rest of their lives. That ought not to be the case. And this bill may be, for all of us who believe that the criminal justice system ought to be fair and equitable, this legislation may be the most important legislation put forth in a very long time. So I commend Senator Jones for his hard work, and I am prepared to support him in his effort in any way I can. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Sharon Rayvert. I am the Executive Director of Peachtree Normal. Thank you to the media for being here, all the supporters, and thank you to Senator Fort, Representative Hagler, and to Senator Jones for this very cutting-edge legislation for Georgia. Today we're here in support of SB 254. We waste $93 billion a year fighting this war on drugs. And it's time for Georgia to find a new approach. Citizens do no longer want to arrest people for marijuana. It was shown in a public policy poll that we did in 2014, a couple days after medical marijuana was mentioned under the state capitol, and 64% of likely voters support no more arrests for marijuana. We need a new approach. As Georgia continues the work on criminal justice reform that we've been doing over the past few years, we would be remiss not to look at the one thing that entangles the most citizens in Georgia into the criminal justice system for their first time: cannabis. 1 in 3 of our young people will be arrested before they hit 23. We must reform Georgia's draconian laws, as 26 other states have done. We must end this to end mass incarceration of our citizens. Our communities are breaking under the pressure. We ask for your support as citizens. Please, if you have a moment, call your legislator and ask them to support SB 254. Again, thank you for being here.
Thank you all for being here. First of all, this is not a slippery slope. I feel it's a path to some justice in this state. But my name is James Bell. I represent the Georgia Care Project, the Campaign for Access, Reform, and Education. We feel the simple possession of marijuana should not be a felony. These felony laws do more harm than good. A felony conviction will carry out throughout a person's life, affecting their educational and job opportunities. We estimate 1 million Georgians currently use marijuana in some form or fashion for either relaxation or for medicine. Georgia has some of the toughest marijuana laws in the nation. These harsh laws are unnecessary. Felony arrests affect minority and young people disproportionately. House Bill 254 is in line with Governor Deal's criminal justice reform package to reduce the nonviolent offenders we have in our prison system. Georgia still has some of the largest prison population in the nation. Felony marijuana laws are contributing to these numbers. We know the voters of Georgia will support these changes, and we encourage the Georgia General Assembly to study and implement these changes. Thank you, Senator Jones, for bringing this issue to light.
my name's Tom McCain. I'm a retired Air Force Master Sergeant. I'm also a retired Georgia Peace Officer, retired as Chief Deputy at Johnson County. I'm currently the Executive Director of Spartacus Legal Foundation. And I just want to thank Senator Jones, and I want to thank the other sponsors of this bill for filing this much needed legislation. During my law enforcement career, I saw too many young lives ruined over quantities of marijuana between 1 and 4 ounces. And I always found it to be just disproportionate and unfair and unjust. And one of the other things that I noticed was, just tagging on what Representative Dawkins Hagler has said here, is that, you know, in Georgia, you're 4 times more likely to be arrested for a misdemeanor marijuana charge if you're a black male than you are if you're a white male. Those statistics are out there, and it's just egregious to me. So, and I thank you for, you know, I'm going to support any bill that gets submitted about this. Of course, this, you know, marijuana is the hot topic these days. The old stigmas are starting to fall away. And, you know, this discussion is here to stay. It's not going to stop. It's something that's very important in today's political landscape. And here in Georgia, it's time for legislation such as this. It's time for a more sensible approach to the subject, and it's time to stop ruining lives over a plant. Thank you.
Now, we'll have opportunity for any questions if anybody has.
Have you had any reaction from law enforcement to your bill proposal?
Some reaction, some has been positive. One of the things I do, and I don't want to give the impression that he's weighed in it one way or the other, but I'm also a former prosecutor and also represent the Sheriff's Office in Richmond County. So I've had contact with law enforcement, and most of the comment is, well, we will follow the law, whatever it may be. So that's pretty much where we are on that issue.
Governor Dale is very concerned about mass incarceration and reform of criminal justice, and this bill would certainly help in those areas. Does he support it?
I have not had an opportunity to speak with the governor, but we hope that this is part of that particular conversation. That is the key. It had to be a starting point, and this was one of those starting points to go ahead and get the conversation started. With any bill, with any major legislation, it takes time. But if it doesn't start at some point in time, we won't go anywhere. And I also want to make the point that not only are we talking about mass incarceration, because that is one of the aspects that we constantly talk about, but what is also important is when a person loses the right to vote, loses the right to sit on a jury, loses a college scholarship, is put out of school. All of that's pursuant to Georgia law, loses the opportunity to receive food stamps or use the opportunity to receive other benefits. That is also very detrimental to persons. That has a tremendous economic impact to our citizens. So not only are we concerned about mass incarceration, but we have to think about all the other thousands of citizens that also lose opportunities because we are punishing this as a felony.
Senator Jones, does this conflict with federal law?
No, because you're not legalizing. There's no legalization. As far as selling is concerned, it still would be a felony. In Georgia, selling at any amount would still be a felony. Also, I know that persons have asked, well, what if it goes over a certain amount, or if it's a pound or something of that nature? Remember, even today, when you're selling marijuana, it could be just a half a joint. You actually could be charged with selling. The key is how is it packaged. The key is whether you have scales. The key is what are you doing with the particular marijuana. So when we talk about the fact that possession would be charged only as a misdemeanor, that doesn't mean that a person necessarily could just ride around with pounds and pounds of marijuana and not be charged with selling. That's not what that means at all. The prosecution would still have to prove its case as far as selling is concerned. They can do that right now. You look at the surrounding facts and circumstances that go with how much marijuana the person is carrying. So it would not have that kind of impact as far as selling marijuana. We understand that the argument can be made. We heard about a slippery slope argument. Understand that. But remember, when we talk about slippery slope with legislation, there's a lot of slopes that have to be fallen down before you get to that point. Bill has to actually be drafted, it has to actually go through committee, it actually has to have a hearing. So this is not necessarily a slippery slope to legalization or decriminalization. All it is an opportunity to give Georgians hope that they won't lose so many different benefits and so many collateral circumstances that happen to them.
Well, if the argument is that you want to help people who are losing all these benefits, serving on a jury and all that, then why look just at marijuana? I mean, there are other things that are viewed as crimes now that would force somebody to give up those same benefits. Well, why just look at this?
Well, I guess you want to say, well, how do we kind of characterize it? Number one, why not look at other drug crimes? We're talking about property crimes. We're talking about crimes of violence. Certainly those are a totally different conversation. Now then, to probably address it a little bit more thoroughly is, how about other drug crimes and how does that fit? And I think if we look at the research as far as the detriment that marijuana has on a person, this is what right now is probably the best conversation we have. We're certainly not going to talk about things like cocaine or heroin. Being a former prosecutor, I see the devastation that that has on families and things of that nature. Much different than this. So although it is part of that drug conversation, it is a much different type of conversation that you're having when we're talking about marijuana.
So you're saying you have evidence that there's no detriment to use of marijuana?
No, what I'm saying is when we talk about, I think, more medically and also just how the punishment itself certainly doesn't fit to lose those type of benefits for marijuana. When we talk about the damage that more harsh drugs of cocaine and heroin and things like that can do, certainly when you start talking about marijuana, whether there's overwhelming medical evidence one way or the other, when you certainly start talking about marijuana and the fact that a young kid could be kicked out of school and that could affect the rest of his life, that kind of punishment does not fit. And all we're doing, remember, is not legalizing. He still is going to have a potential misdemeanor conviction on his record, whatever stigma that has, whatever stigma employers decide to put on that. This just says because you have these harsh penalties as felonies, that should not be enforced. From a felony standpoint, should not be enforced.
Well, does that mean that you don't agree that marijuana is a gateway drug to other drugs?
Question's open, but that's actually a good question in this sense. I'm going to say this. Let's say it was a gateway to other drugs. Then what we're actually saying is that it's an addictive kind of drug. Why then are we going to punish persons in the criminal justice system because of drug addiction in that way? That becomes the question. We're not talking about persons who are selling it. We're talking about, if we are saying that medically a person has a medical problem, why are we putting the criminal justice system into a medical question? So even if we were to accept and say, yes, it could be a gateway drug, my question still would be, why then do we sick the criminal justice system on that person? Because that person needs more treatment than criminal penalties.
Can you talk a little bit about the amount issue? Because I think that might be something that is a little contentious here. Going from, just literally having no limit on what possession means in terms of amount. Can you talk a little bit about why you feel like there shouldn't be a number there, or?
Yes, and obviously with any bill there may be changes to it, but I'll say this when we talk about the number. Number one, how would we base that particular number? If we're still saying, and this is the key, and this is how I kind of looked at it because I have wrestled with the number, and I go back to my earlier comments. If I say that, okay, it's possession, and that person may need help, and they may have more than 12 ounces, or we look at other states, they may have more than 24 ounces, or whatever it may be. Why then, from a possession standpoint, if the prosecution is determined that they can't prove that that person is selling it, that all they had it for was personal use, they've looked at all the facts, they've looked at all the circumstances, and even though this person may have an exorbitant amount, the prosecutor has said, I don't think this person was selling this. All I think this person had it for was possession. Why then should that person then lose so much? We have the potential of losing so much. How do we put that number? Where do we have that arbitrary number to add when we do that? That's why I wrestle with the number, but the number becomes important when you start talking about selling narcotics. That's where it becomes important. And if the prosecutor has looked at all the facts and said, this person isn't selling this, I know it's a lot, but this person isn't selling it, it's for personal use, why then should that person then lose potentially so much? Why do we should do that?
So it seems a lot of the talk about the cannabis industry right now revolves around this word medical, and the bills that are getting the most traction, like HB 1 passed, and then now HB 722 is getting a good amount of attention. Without any language in the bill about medicinal marijuana relative to whatever else, how do you think you can appeal to some of the maybe more conservative voters?
Exactly for the things that I've been saying. Because the fact of the matter is this crosses party lines, it crosses racial lines, it crosses economic lines. Same way you have a woman who may be in downtown Atlanta who's going to lose her federal benefits. Also affects a young student in South Georgia who's at UGA who could possibly lose his scholarship. It affects both the same. So I think that that's why it could be a bipartisan effort and should be a bipartisan effort. And we say bipartisan not just from parties, but bipartisan from economic, bipartisan from social. And that's why I think eventually we'll be able to get some traction on this particular bill.
Will this bill have any effect on a person being booked into jail who has maybe some pot residue in his pocket?
That is actually a bill that is actually being placed in the House that would actually cite for misdemeanor possession charges that it would only be by citation. So it's a separate bill. This bill would not necessarily address that. At this point, I believe it's actually discretionary whether the sheriff or your county would arrest on misdemeanor. On felony, you would have to still arrest.
Well, the question is if he's being booked into jail, he's already been arrested, he's taken to jail, they search his pockets, they find some dust, say it's pot, and then they charge him with felony distribution of marijuana in the prison system.
Well, I may, having been a former prosecutor, I'm not sure. I understand the scenario given. I'm not sure if he would actually be. If he's being booked in jail for another offense, and there's some residue that is found. I'm not sure. Could that happen? Yes, about bringing marijuana into a jail facility. I understand the question, but let me broaden it out a little bit. I certainly understand the question. I certainly understand the potential issue there. But to broaden it out a little bit, would the bill as written allow it to be citation only? Would the state mandate it be citation only? This bill would not. There is a bill that possibly is going to originate in the House, which would say that marijuana would be by citation only, as far as arrest is concerned. So this bill would not necessarily mandate that at all. And I think we have time for probably just a couple more questions.
If this bill is enacted, what impact do you think it would have on our prisons and our systems where we've already talked about things being overcrowded? What difference would it make?
I think it's going to make a huge difference, not only in prisons, and that's one of the ways I don't want to necessarily get caught just in that conversation. It does make a difference. Because certainly if a person starts to get multiple offenses, many times the judge will send to incarceration. It's hard to actually separate those numbers because of the fact that your individual courts would actually have to separate those numbers themselves to have them. Because what many times happens is a person may have multiple offenses and they're placed in jail. So those numbers are difficult to get. But certainly that would have some impact. But I don't want us to get too caught up on just the prison aspect of it, because there's so many other aspects that this does affect. But it certainly does affect that. Because I think if we get only caught up into that aspect, and then persons say, well, guess what, we're not going to necessarily jail persons in prisons anymore. That still doesn't have anything to do with people who lose so many other things. So that doesn't help that argument. And what we're trying to do is help all persons, not only mass incarceration, but persons that lose so many benefits too. Yes, ma'am.
Does it have any effects for retroactively for people who have been already convicted?
It would not have any effect on retroactive. This bill would not address on a retroactive basis.
Do you think that the current law discourages people from using marijuana, and that would your legislation end that deterrent?
No, I don't necessarily think the current law necessarily deters. There's no real evidence to show that. Secondly, the key thing is the penalty aspect of it. Because what are we actually saying once again when we say deter? We're talking about deterring a person from using marijuana, but they're still going to have a criminal offense. Let's don't forget that. It only reduces it from felony to misdemeanor. It still is a criminal offense. So a person still has to decide that they want to take the risk of being part of that criminal justice system, being on probation and things of that nature. So number one, it's probably not a great deterrence to begin with, but secondly, let's remember that we're not legalizing it or even decriminalizing marijuana. Anything else? I guess that's one.
Do you think this bill contradicts or works in tandem with HB 722? Like, say if that model was actually installed and they were able to make a well-regulated system for in-state cultivation, with the government being in charge of all the actual marijuana flower in state, do you think the people behind that bill could take issue with, lessening the charges for people in possession of something that should be government controlled?
Well, it's a good question. I don't think they're in conflict at all, but I don't think they necessarily marry either. But they're certainly not in conflict with each other. And the bottom line is what we're mostly focusing on is the penalty aspect of it. That's what this bill primarily is focusing upon. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you so much. Good to see you again. Thank you for coming out.